Yes, welcome to NiCHE Conversations. I am Jessica DeWitt, one of the editors here at the network in Canadian History and Environment. And today I am joined by Lauren Wheeler. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Lauren Wheeler. I am joining you here from Edmonton, Alberta on Treaty 6 territory, and I work with the Alberta Museums Association as the Strategic Services Director.
Yes. Yes, and Lauren and I go way back because I think when you were like the NiCHE scholar representative, like right when I started my PhD.
Yeah.
But I think it's been like, gosh, I don't think I've seen you in person since like 2015 or 2016, but anyways.
It's been a very long time.
Yes.
My past life as an environmental historian before I dove into all of the museums.
Yes, and you can read about that in Lauren's Rhizomes interview on our site. But today, we are revisiting a post that Lauren wrote for us in 2011. And the reason we're revisiting this, and I like to do this, is that, we got a new comment on it and from a person in the public. And I think it's always cool to kind of like look back and think about things that we've written in the past or how things have changed through time. So this post was Dr. Otto Schaefer's Slides of Canada's North. And the comment we got on it was kind of someone was like, yo, where can I look at these slides? And that's how we've gotten to this point today. So I thought we'd chat a little bit about it. And first up, can you tell us, who was Otto Schaefer, first of all, and, what is so great about these slides?
So Otto Schaefer was born in Germany in 1919, went to medical school there, and came to Canada in 1951, specifically to work in the North. According to his biographies, obituaries, a book written about him called Sunset in Pangertung, he was always interested in the Inuit and the North from a really early age. Mm-hmm. So for him, getting to come to Canada was kind of like a lifelong dream. So he comes here in 1951 and starts working at the Charles Camsell Hospital here in Edmonton. And the Charles Camsell Hospital was an Indian hospital, and it was largely for people who can be treated in their home communities. It was a lot of tuberculosis patients. Mm-hmm. The building itself is currently being converted into apartments, and there's been a lot of reconciliation and healing around the site because there's a lot of hurt connected to that particular hospital as part of that larger story around treaty colonialism and residential schools. So that's the first place that Schaefer works, and that's his like on the ground learning what it is. Mm-hmm. His wife comes and joins him in 1952. She actually left her medical studies to come to Canada, and by 1953, they're in Aklavik working in the North. They had 5 children while they were living and working between the North and Edmonton. And it was very much like their whole family was part of this community. And what Schaefer did after Aklavik was get moved, always coming back to Edmonton in between for the capsule. He then moved on to Pangertung, and he was in Pangertung for almost a decade. And that's a really long time for a medical professional to be in a community. Mm-hmm. After that, he was back in Edmonton for a bit, in Whitehorse for a very short time. Then he became the director of the National Medical Unit, which was based out of Edmonton with the U of A and the Charles Camsell. And as director of that unit, he went on 2 tours of the North on the C.D. Howe icebreaker. And the tours were to do surveys of health in northern communities, which he had a pretty close understanding of. He ends up being really a forefather of this idea of circumpolar health and looking at the North as a unit to study health, not just in Canada, but in other polar regions. He wrote over 100 articles about health in the North, and and also did a lot of presenting. So the slides that I looked at there was over 3,000 of them, and they cover basically his life from arriving in Canada, living in Aklavik, Pangertung, Whitehorse, a bit in Edmonton, as well as all the slides from his presentations, which was really, really interesting because you got to see kind of like him and his life and his family and the places where he was going and the way that he was doing medicine. But then you also got to see how he was presenting that information to others as a professional. And it was a really interesting collection to work through. The work that I did was around an initial inventory of the slides so that they could be cataloged. The hope or the idea was when I was doing it was that the slides would be digitized and put on a new website the U of A had developed called ERA, which is the Education and Research Archives. So it was meant to be, and it is, the central site for a digital archive of the research and educational products of the university.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where these slides were meant to go. We had no idea going in what was on the slides. It was literally just boxes that one of his daughters had brought because his papers were already at the University of Alberta archives. And his connection to circumpolar health had connected him with the Canadian Circumpolar Institute, which is who she gave the slides to, which is itself interesting because slides would generally go to an archive as non-textual materials, but these ones ended up at this little Circumpolar Institute with a non-archivist doing the initial inventory. But it was really interesting. And yeah, I don't know if you want to ask about the slides themselves or.
Yeah, I mean, you've kind of hinted at in the piece you kind of talk about a bit of like the content of the slides. And a lot of Inuit imagery, some imagery that is you may not see elsewhere. That's a bit graphic. Yeah, I don't know if you want to touch upon that a little bit.
Sure. The slides kind of, in my view, fell into 4 categories. One is just the landscape of the places that he was going to and what he was seeing as he traveled the north and traveled Canada. The other is just kind of his daily life. There were pictures of his kids. There was pictures of going to dances and school gyms. There was pictures of, he and his wife trying to figure out how to keep oranges fresh through the winter by freezing them and thawing them and what that looked like. There were the images of his data from his work. And then there were what I thought at the time and still feel were really sensitive images. Some of those were things like how he would set up for surgery in the middle of the winter using only seal oil and whale oil lamps for light. So really, from a medical history perspective, really interesting. But there were also pictures of his patients. And there may or may not be names on those pictures. There were pictures of the community members that he was interacting with all the time. And when you have those images and they're connected to medicine, you don't know if that happy smiling person is also someone he had just treated for something serious. You also don't have a name for most of the people in these images, which presents a whole other set of problems that archives have been working really hard to address through naming projects and that sort of thing. So in that initial inventory, it became really clear that there were things that could be public and it would be easy to make them public. But there were also a lot of things that would have to be treated differently and with a bit more sensitivity and more collaboration with the communities these slides came from. One of them was one that came up over and over again, and this is one that really kind of hit home for me why it mattered to not make them public, and that was a really sad image of an Inuit man in an igloo dying of tuberculosis. And Schaefer wrote on his slides, he wrote in a mixture of German, English, and Inuktitut. It was really hard to figure out what the hell he was trying to say about most of them. Also, he was a doctor, so it was just chicken scratch, as you can see from some of the pictures in the piece. in this particular slide, it gave the name of the man and it gave what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
And then it said, did not want to be evacuated because he was afraid he wouldn't come home. And as a historian of Western Canada, as a settler to this place, that line about was afraid he wouldn't come home really, really hit hard, because that's when you read about the Charles Camsell Hospital now, that's the thing that hits the most, is that people were evacuated there and they died there and they never got to go home.
Yeah.
So for me, this one picture that the first time I came across was with all the annotation. And then I kept coming across in slide decks from presentations and other things, really kind of highlighted that there was a huge value to this collection, but also there was a lot of sensitive piece to it that needed to be treated very, very carefully.
Mm-hmm.
After I did my initial inventory of the slides, the next year, the Circumpolar Institute was able to get another Young Canada Works grant to hire a library student to do a proper cataloging with the right terms, all the right nomenclatures, and to do a scan with a really big, proper slide scanner. So to my understanding from the last conversations that I've had with the people at the Institute was that all the slides are digitized, and they're digitized as high resolution, high quality, so you can really see what they are. They've been cataloged and given the right descriptive pieces, but with the exception of 9, they are not available to the public because of how sensitive the contents are. The only time the slides have been kind of on display was in 2014 when Dr. Caroline Leathers did a little exhibit of them called Medicine by Dog Sled. Caroline is a medical historian. She teaches at King's University here in Edmonton, and she's very much interested in colonial medicine and how it's delivered, as well as kind of a history of disabilities. So she looked at this as a study on how do you deliver medicine in a remote place? And Schaefer's slides show that really, really clearly. The exhibit itself, I think, was up for a few months, came down, and that's it. And the slides that she would have had in that exhibit were pictures of traveling by dog sled, traveling by float plane, very generic and non-sensitive pieces about delivery over content, if that makes sense. So it's an interesting collection, and the decision to keep it inaccessible, I do think is the right decision, because as someone, it was one of the few people who's seen all the slides. It's heavy stuff, and it's some of it's really, really hard to look at. So.
Yeah, I appreciate this example of just I think we have this idea in our mind, a lot of us, or like generally, that archival digitization means mass access, right? Immediately, that means that these things will be accessible, right? Or they should be accessible as soon as they're digitized. And this is like really a story of how you need to take a step back and really think about the content, and that accessibility, broad accessibility isn't always the best option. I know, like, I work with the Saskatchewan History and Folklore Society, and we have a lot of images of Indigenous folks that we digitized and put on our website, and now we're kind of taking a step back because we don't know who these people are, and kind of visiting communities and asking them, do you know who these people are you okay with this image being shown, like checking in with them. And I just think that this is a really good example of it.
There's like you said, there's this, when we started digitizing things, and this is me speaking as a public historian
Yeah.
and museum person as opposed to an environmental historian. But when we started digitizing things, the idea was this is going to be awesome. These things that you would have to go to the archives to get, that are inaccessible because of distance, because of cost of travel, will be accessible.
Yeah.
And then we quickly realized as a sector the pitfalls of digitization. The first one was it's ridiculously expensive to digitize. The second was that the way you're storing them digitally sometimes deteriorates, and that's something archives are constantly fighting against. And then the last one that has become the crux of digitization for a lot of people is the content. Like, you're not just sharing what sat in the archive. When it sat in the archive and you had to go there in person and you have to talk to the archivist to get the pieces out, there's a bit of gatekeeping that can happen, and there's a knowledge of what is being pulled that gets lost when it's digitized.
Yeah.
And when it comes to the plethora of images taken of Indigenous peoples, often without their consent or without their knowledge, it means that there's extra baggage that comes with those images. And there's been projects, there's been naming projects. There's been one that's going on for coming on 20 years out of Ottawa, with communities in the north, with photographs from the National Archives. There's been projects happening in communities in BC, communities in Alberta, and they call it visual repatriation, because you're giving back the images. And part of that process is the importance of naming the people so they're no longer anonymous. But the other part of the process is a return of evidence of existence and evidence of culture. Some of these pictures are showing traditions that were lost or near extinction because of the genocidal components of that residential school and day school. And that means that those images carry a lot more for an Indigenous community. And they may be depicting something that community doesn't want shown, something that's private. An example from the West is that the Blackfoot have a tradition of the Sundance. The Sundance is a closed ceremony. Unless you're invited in, you're not supposed to see it. And yet, there exist pictures of Sundance that people might not have known were Sundance. And that having that as something you could digitally access is going against the cultures of the Blackfoot. And that's just kind of a big example of why it matters for places that hold visual images of Indigenous peoples, Indigenous cultures and customs, are really attentive to how open the access is and are in conversation with the source communities about what should be closed off, what can be public, and how they mitigate that access. There is amazing things that can be done with access for especially on reserve communities and northern communities to access these images and reclaim their ancestors and their stories and their culture or their traditions. But in the South, in settler communities, we may have to wait a while before it's okay for us to be using those as research material. And that's just something that we have to get used to. Yeah. Just because it's there and it's digitized doesn't mean we have a right to access it. And I feel like Dr. Schaefer's slides very much fall in that category. It's there, it's digitized, but it's not our turn to use it. Yeah. It needs to go back to Aklavik, to Pangnirtung, to Whitehorse, to the various communities on Baffin Island that he went to, for them to have first. And when they say it's okay, then we can use them. And we can learn some really, really interesting things about medicine in the North and how in the 1960s, Dr. Schaefer was already saying the Southern diet is killing people and they are healthier on a traditional diet. 1960s, which we don't generally think about when we think about the kind of nutritional colonization of the North, and how early it was evident that processed foods not from the land, were detrimental to the health and well-being of the Inuit communities.
Wow. Yeah, this is such an important topic. I really appreciate you joining me today to discuss it. I think personally, as a researcher, one of the biggest things I've had to learn from you, the start of my grad school years to now, is learning when to understand and accept when I'm not the person to research something or to write about something or to access something. Like being like, this is interesting and it's important, but it's not for me, right? I need to step back and let others who are closer to the topic or closer to the culture, etc., lead the way. And yeah. Anyways, that's just from a personal standpoint. But yeah, I just think this Otto Schaefer slide collection was such a good example. And yeah, thanks for joining me today to talk
No
about these issues.
problem.
Yeah. Everyone should check out that post. I'll post it to our stories. And yeah, thanks, Lauren.
No problem. Thank you, Jessica. Bye.
Take care.